When I came home from the hospital, there was suddenly a second refrigerator in the kitchen. My son said coldly, "That one's mine. Buy your own damn food." My daughter-in-law had put her name on everything. I stayed silent. The next day they cried when they saw what had happened. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. The pristine, quiet hum of the Lincoln Town car was a world away from the cacophony of beeps and sterile announcements that had been the soundtrack of my life for the past 3 weeks. I leaned my head against the cool leather of the back seat, watching the familiar scenery of my neighborhood slide past the window. The oak trees, their leaves just beginning to blush with the first hints of autumn, stood like steadfast old friends lining the quiet sun-dappled street. Each passing house, each manicured lawn, was a verse in a poem I knew by heart. My poem. My street. After 23 days in the cardiac unit of St. Mary's following a triple bypass surgery, coming home felt like the final shaky stanza of a prayer being answered. At 68, I was more acquainted with my own fragility than I had ever wanted to be. My body felt like a borrowed suit, ill-fitting and tender, but my mind, the part of me that had spent 40 years teaching American history to teenagers, felt sharp, observant, and deeply, deeply tired. My husband, Robert, had been gone for 2 years now, and his absence was a hollow ache that the sterile scent of the hospital had only amplified. He had been the loud, booming presence in our quiet life, the savvy businessman who had built a small fortune in logistics, while I had been the steady academic heart of our home. Without him, the house was just a house. It was up to me to make it a home again. The car pulled into my driveway, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. There it was. The 2-story brick colonial Robert and I had bought 42 years ago, the place where we'd raised our son Kevin from a scraped-kneed boy into a man. The sight of it, solid and dependable, sent a wave of profound relief through me. My son, my Kevin, was inside. He and his wife, Tiffany, had insisted on moving in while I was in the hospital, to take care of things. It was a gesture that at the time had touched me. My son stepping up, my daughter-in-law being supportive. In my morphine-laced haze, it had seemed like a blessing. Kevin came out the front door as the driver helped me from the car. He was 41 with my high cheekbones but a softness around his middle that spoke of a life of comfort he hadn't built for himself. He wore expensive track pants and a polo shirt that strained slightly at the buttons. A man perpetually trying to project a level of success he hadn't quite achieved. "Mom, you're home," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too bright. He gave me a quick, awkward hug, his hands patting my back gently, as if afraid the delicate china of his mother might shatter. "You look rested." "I'd rather be tired in my own bed than rested in theirs," I said with a weak smile. Tiffany appeared behind him, a vision in a pristine white lounge suit. Her nails were perfectly manicured, her smile was bright, practiced, and it never quite reached her calculating eyes. She was the picture of modern entitlement, a woman who had married into a comfortable life and saw it as her due. "Eleanor, it's so good to have you back," she chirped, her voice as smooth and artificial as her acrylic nails. "We've been keeping everything perfect for you." They ushered me inside, chattering about the neighbors who had sent cards, the mail that had piled up. The house was clean. Spotless. In fact, too spotless. The comfortable lived-in clutter of my life had been organized into sterile oblivion. My collection of history books on the coffee table was gone, replaced by a single artfully placed orchid. The photos of Robert on the mantelpiece seemed to have been rearranged, pushed slightly to the side. A faint, unfamiliar scent of lavender and vanilla air freshener hung in the air, masking the familiar, comforting smell of old books and lemon polish. It felt less like my home and more like a high-end rental property being staged for a viewing. I was a guest in the museum of my own life. "Let me get you a glass of water, Mom," Kevin said. "You need to stay hydrated." "Thank you, sweetheart," I murmured, my heart aching with a gratitude that felt slightly misplaced. I was home. That was all that mattered. The rest was just adjustment. I followed him toward the kitchen, my hand trailing along the familiar wallpaper in the hall, desperate for a connection to the life that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. The kitchen had always been my sanctuary. It was a large, open room with warm cherrywood cabinets and a large butcher block island, where Robert and I had drunk a million cups of coffee. It was the soul of the house, but as I stepped through the doorway I stopped dead, my breath caught in my chest, a sharp, painful snag that had nothing to do with my healing incision. There, humming with a quiet, alien presence next to my familiar almond-colored refrigerator, was a second one. It was a massive, gleaming stainless steel behemoth. The kind with double doors and a built-in ice dispenser that shot out cubes with unnerving efficiency. It was utterly out of place. A chrome invader in my warm, traditional kitchen. I stared at it, my mind struggling to process the intrusion. It was such a small thing, a simple appliance, but it felt like a profound violation, a flag planted on conquered territory. "Oh," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You bought a new refrigerator." Kevin had a glass in his hand, but he didn't move toward my old fridge. He walked to the new one. "Needed more space," he said, his back to me. "With all the meal prepping Tiffany does, you know, for our diets." I watched confused, as he filled the glass with filtered water from the dispenser. He turned and handed it to me. I took a sip, the cold water a shock to my system. I needed to sit down. My legs felt weak. I started to drift toward my old refrigerator, my hand outstretched, thinking I'd grab an apple from the crisper. Kevin's voice stopped me. It was sharp, devoid of the forced cheerfulness he'd greeted me with. It was cold. "Mom, don't." I turned to look at him, my hand hovering in the air. His expression was flat, his eyes hard. He gestured with his chin toward the new, gleaming appliance. "That one's mine," he said, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate tone that chilled me to the bone. "You can use the old one. We've separated things. To make it easier." He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was looking at a spot on the wall just over my shoulder, and then he delivered the line that cracked the fragile veneer of my homecoming right down the middle. "Buy your own damn food." My son said that to me. My son. In my kitchen. In the house where I had raised him, fed him, nurtured him. The words hung in the air, ugly and sharp. Before I could even begin to process the cruelty of it, my gaze drifted past him, and that's when I saw them. Labels. Small, white, rectangular labels, with Tiffany's neat, cursive handwriting on them. There was one on the pantry door that read Tiffany and Kevin's Dry Goods. Do not use. There was another on the coffee canister by the machine, and another on the knife block. I looked around the room, truly seeing it for the first time. They were everywhere, on the cabinet doors, on the drawers containing the silverware, the dish towels, the pots and pans. My entire kitchen, my entire life, had been catalogued, claimed, and cordoned off. Her name was on everything. I was no longer the matriarch of this house. I was an intruder, a tenant, a problem to be managed. A wave of dizziness washed over me. The surgical wound on my chest throbbed with a sudden sharp pain. I saw the smug, triumphant look on Tiffany's face as she leaned against the doorway, watching the scene unfold. She had been waiting for this. This was her victory. This was the moment she finally took ownership of the life she believed she was owed. I looked from her smug face to my son's averted one. He couldn't even look at me. The shame was there, flickering in his eyes, but it was buried deep beneath a layer of resentment so thick it was suffocating. I opened my mouth to say something, to scream, to cry, to demand an explanation for this monstrous, petty cruelty, but the words wouldn't come. The history teacher in me, the woman who had spent a lifetime studying the slow, insidious nature of coups and revolutions, took over. This was not a random act of disrespect. This was a calculated, strategic maneuver. This was an occupation. And so, I stayed silent. I simply nodded, my face a blank, unreadable mask. I took another sip of water, turned without a word, and walked out of my kitchen, leaving them standing in their newly conquered territory. The war had been declared, and I hadn't even known I was a combatant. But I knew one thing with a certainty that settled deep in my weary bones. They had no idea who they were fighting. Instead of confronting them, I retreated. It was a strategic withdrawal, a lesson I'd learned from studying countless historical battles. You never engage the enemy until you understand the terrain and the full scope of their forces. My home was no longer my home. It was a contested territory, and I was outnumbered. My son and his wife had formed an alliance, and their objective, though not yet fully stated, was becoming terrifyingly clear. They wanted to displace me. I spent the rest of the day in the sunroom, a quiet, glass-walled space at the back of the house that overlooked my garden. I told them I was tired and needed to rest, an excuse they readily accepted. It fit their narrative of me as a frail, post-operative invalid. They left me alone, which was exactly what I wanted. From my vantage point in a comfortable wicker armchair, I could observe the new rhythms of the house without being seen. I was a ghost in my own home, a silent, watching presence. They moved about with a proprietary air, their voices loud and unconcerned. Tiffany was on the phone for hours talking to her friends in a triumphant hushed tone. I couldn't hear the words, but the cadence was unmistakable. It was the sound of gossip, of victory being shared. She described her new kitchen, her plans for redecorating the living room, her voice dripping with a smug satisfaction that made my skin crawl. She was not a caretaker. She was a conqueror, detailing the spoils of war. Kevin spent the afternoon in the living room, sprawled on my sofa, watching a football game at a volume that rattled the windows. He drank beer from a can, leaving a condensation ring on the polished cherrywood end table. Robert had cherished. It was a small act of desecration, but it was telling. He was no longer a guest, bound by the rules of respect. He was an owner, and the house and everything in it were now subject to his whims. They ate dinner together in front of the television, off trays. They had ordered pizza, and the greasy, pungent smell filled the house. They didn't offer me any. They didn't even ask if I was hungry. They simply ate, their eyes glued to the screen, occasionally murmuring to each other. They moved around me, through me, as if I were a piece of furniture they had grown accustomed to and no longer noticed. The silence from my end was a vacuum, they filled with their own casual cruelty and disregard. Later that evening, I overheard a hushed, anxious conversation from the kitchen. This time their voices were low, urgent. I crept closer to the sunroom door, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Did you talk to him?" Tiffany asked, her voice sharp with impatience. "Not yet," Kevin mumbled. "He said he'd have them ready by tomorrow afternoon." "It's not a simple thing, Tiff. It has to be airtight." "It needs to be done, Kevin," she insisted, "before she gets her strength back. Look at her, she's out of it. She's in no state to make decisions. Now is the time." I know, he said, his voice a mixture of guilt and greed. "But we have to be smart about this. If we push too hard, she might get suspicious." "Suspicious?" Tiffany scoffed. "She thinks we're here to fluff her pillows. We just need to get the paperwork sorted. Get her signature and it's done. The house, the accounts, everything. It's what Dad would have wanted, for us to be secure." The casual invocation of Robert's name was a desecration. Robert. My careful, meticulous husband would have been horrified. He had loved Kevin, but he had never been blind to his son's weaknesses. His laziness, his sense of entitlement, the way he had married a woman who saw him not as a partner but as an investment. The paperwork. Her signature. It was all starting to make a horrible kind of sense. The second refrigerator, the labels, the complete takeover of the house. It wasn't just about disrespect. It was psychological warfare. They were trying to make me feel helpless, senile and dependent. They were creating an environment where a woman who had just had her chest cracked open would feel so overwhelmed and grateful for their care that she would sign anything they put in front of her without question. A cold dread, colder than any hospital room, settled over me. My son, my own flesh and blood, was conspiring with his wife to strip me of my home, my autonomy and my dignity. They were circling like vultures, waiting for the old lioness to be weak enough to go for the kill. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal instinct to fight back, to storm into the kitchen and unleash a torrent of rage and recrimination. But I held back. My silence had been my shield all day, and now I realized it was also my greatest weapon. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought it was confusion. They had no idea it was observation. They had no idea it was the quiet, patient gathering of intelligence before the battle. Let them think I was a ghost. Let them think I was a frail old woman fading into the background. Ghosts can walk through walls, and this ghost was about to walk into her husband's study and find out exactly what kind of paperwork her son was so eager to get his hands on. That night, long after the drone of the television had fallen silent and the loud, intrusive snores of my son had begun to emanate from my master bedroom, I rose from the guest bed they had so generously assigned me. The house was dark, the only light a pale, milky wash from the moon filtering through the windows. I moved without a sound, my bare feet padding softly on the thick hallway runner. Every creak of the old house, usually a comforting, familiar sound, now seemed like a potential betrayal, a signal to the enemy. My destination was Robert's study. It was at the far end of the hall, a room that had been his sanctuary and since his passing had become mine. It was the one room in the house that still felt wholly ours, a library of our shared life. The walls were lined with books on history, business and classic literature. His old leather armchair still sat by the fireplace, the imprint of his body seemingly still there. And against the far wall was my desk, A beautiful antique mahogany piece that had been my grandmother. It was where I kept all our important household documents, the sinew and bone of our life together. As I pushed the heavy oak door open, a sliver of moonlight cut across the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air. Everything looked as it should. The books were in their places. The armchair stood silent sentinel. The air smelled of old paper and leather. But as I drew closer to my desk, my heart began to pound with a slow, heavy dread. Something was wrong. It was a small thing, a detail only I would notice. A stack of books on the corner of the desk was slightly askew. A pen that I always kept perfectly parallel to the blotter was now at an angle. And the top drawer, the one I always kept locked, was closed but not quite flush with the frame. It was out by a millimeter, a silent testament to a lock that had been picked. Someone had been in my desk. My breath hitched. I pulled the drawer open. It moved with a smooth, oiled glide, the lock clearly having been professionally bypassed. Inside, everything was neat, but it was a fraudulent neatness. The files were all there, but they were not in the precise order I had left them. Someone had gone through them, carefully, methodically, and then tried to cover their tracks. My hands trembled as I lifted out the most important file, a thick, green accordion folder labeled Vance Household and Estate. This was the folder that contained everything: the deed to the house, my insurance policies, our wills, Robert's death certificate. It contained the paper trail of our entire 42 years in this house. I carried the folder to the desk and sat down in my chair. With a sense of impending doom, I opened it. Everything seemed to be there. The deed, crisp and official, the insurance papers, our old mortgage documents, stamped paid in full, in a satisfying heavy red ink. I sifted through the papers, my fingers searching for the source of my unease. And then I found it. Tucked at the very back of the folder, behind my own will, were 3 documents I had never seen before in my life. They were fresh, the paper a stark, bright white against the older, softer cream of the other documents. They looked official. They had been professionally drafted and printed. The first was a durable power of attorney form. It was a comprehensive document that would grant the designated agent sweeping powers over all my financial affairs. The ability to sell property, access bank accounts, manage investments. The agent's name was already typed in. Kevin Vance. A secondary agent was also listed. Tiffany Vance. The second document was a medical power of attorney. It was even more chilling. It would give Kevin and Tiffany the authority to make all medical decisions on my behalf. Should I be deemed incapacitated, the power to choose my doctors, my treatments, the power to decide when to pull the plug. My blood ran cold. They weren't just planning to take my house. They were planning to take my life, my autonomy, my very right to exist. They were preparing to have me declared incompetent, a frail old woman with a failing heart and a failing mind, so they could assume complete and total control. But it was the third document that was the most brazen, the most cruel. It was a quitclaim deed. A simple one-page document designed to transfer ownership of a property from one party to another. The property listed was this house. My house. My name and details were already filled in under grantor, and under grantee 2 names were neatly typed: Kevin Vance and Tiffany Vance, as joint tenants. All that was missing was my signature. I stared at the papers, at the neat black font that laid out the complete and total annihilation of my life, and I felt a profound, soul-deep sickness. This was premeditated. This was a coup, planned with the cold, calculating precision of a corporate takeover. The loving son, the concerned daughter-in-law. It was all a performance, a carefully constructed lie designed to lull me into a state of dependent gratitude. They had been waiting for me to be at my most vulnerable, fresh from the surgeon's knife, to stage their final devastating move. They thought my heart was weak. They were about to find out they had profoundly misjudged the strength of my will. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, washed over me, not for myself but for Robert. Oh, Robert, I thought, his handsome smiling face swimming in my vision. You would have seen this coming. You always saw everything coming. Robert had been a planner, a man who believed in contingencies and safety nets. He was a savvy, street-smart businessman who trusted few and always had a backup plan for his backup plan. He had spent his life protecting me, protecting us, and in that moment of despair a memory surfaced, a flicker of something he had said years ago when we were drafting our final wills with our lawyer. You always have to plan for the snakes in the grass, Eleanor, he had said, his voice a low, serious rumble. Even the ones that share your blood. The snakes in the grass? He had known his son's character, his wife's ambition. He had seen the potential for this betrayal long before I ever had. And that's when I remembered the safe. Behind a row of leather-bound history books on the bottom shelf was a small hidden wall safe. It was where Robert kept our most critical financial records, the original copies of everything important. I hadn't opened it in the 2 years since his death. I hadn't needed to. My hands shook as I pulled the heavy volumes of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire from the shelf. Behind them, the small gray metal door of the safe was flush with the wall. I slowly turned the combination dial, the numbers clicking softly in the silent room, a sequence I knew as well as my own name. The lock disengaged with a solid, satisfying thud. I pulled the heavy door open. Inside, everything was exactly as Robert had left it. Neat stacks of stock certificates, bond statements, and a few pieces of my mother's jewelry. And on the top of it all was a thick blue portfolio, just like the one on my desk, but this one was embossed in gold leaf with the words, "The Robert and Eleanor Vance Family Trust, Master File." It was the legal entity that Robert had insisted we create, the ironclad trust that held all our major assets, including the house, our investment portfolio, and our savings. It was designed to protect our legacy, to ensure our financial security for the rest of our lives. My fingers trembled as I lifted the heavy portfolio out of the safe. It felt like a lifeline, a message from my husband from beyond the grave. Clipped to the very front of the file, glinting in the moonlight, was a single crisp white business card. It was old, the corners slightly softened with age, but the text was clear. Martin Hayes, Esque Estate and Trust Law. Mr. Hayes, our old trusted lawyer, a kind, shrewd man who had been Robert's friend since childhood. I hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. I looked at the card, then at the deceitful documents still lying on my desk. The snakes were in the grass, but Robert had left me a map, and a weapon. The quiet, observant history teacher was done observing. The battle for my home, for my life was about to begin, and I was not going to fight it alone. The first hint of dawn was a pale gray smudge on the eastern horizon when I finally closed the blue portfolio. I had spent the entire night in Robert's study, the moonlight giving way to the soft glow of his old brass desk lamp. I had read through the entire trust document, every dense, legalistic page, and with every page, my grief and fear had slowly, miraculously transformed into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. Robert, my brilliant, prescient husband, had saved me. He had saved us. I picked up my phone, my fingers steady as I dialed the number on Martin Hayes's business card. It was just after 6 a.m. I knew it was an ungodly hour to call, but I also knew Martin was an early riser, just as Robert had been. He answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep but instantly alert. Martin Hayes speaking. Martin, I said, my voice a quiet whisper. It's Eleanor Vance. There was a moment of surprised silence, and then his voice warmed with a genuine concern that almost brought me to tears. Eleanor, my goodness, it's been too long. Is everything all right? I heard about your surgery. I've been meaning to call. I'm recovering, Martin, I said, but I'm afraid everything is very much not all right. I need your help. I'm in a delicate situation. For the next 10 minutes I laid it all out for him. I told him about Kevin and Tiffany moving in. I told him about the second refrigerator, the labels on my cabinets, my son's cruel words, and I told him about the documents I had found in my desk, the power of attorney forms, the quitclaim deed, the meticulously planned coup designed to strip me of everything. As I spoke, the only sound on the other end of the line was Martin's quiet, focused breathing. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened, a master of his craft, absorbing every detail, every nuance of the case I was presenting. When I finished, the silence stretched for a long moment. The little vultures, he finally said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. The kindness was gone, replaced by the cold fury of a lawyer who has just seen a profound injustice. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. Robert always worried about this. He worried that Kevin didn't have the character to handle the responsibility of what you two had built. He was right, I whispered, the admission a painful lump in my throat. Okay, Martin said, his voice shifting into a crisp professional tone. First, and this is the most important thing, you do not confront them, not a word. You are still the frail, recovering mother. You are weak, you are confused. You are grateful for their presence. Do you understand? Your silence is your shield right now. Let them think their plan is working. I understand, I said. Good, he continued. Now do you still have the master file for the trust? The blue portfolio from the safe? It's right in front of me, I confirmed. Excellent. Now I'm sure you've already read through it, but allow me to draw your attention to a specific provision that Robert and I spent a great deal of time crafting. He used to call it his scorched earth clause. It's in Article 4, Section B. Do you see it? I flipped through the heavy pages until I found the section he was referring to. The legal language was dense, but the intent was unmistakable. I read the words, and a slow, incredulous smile spread across my face. It was a work of pure strategic genius. It was Robert's final checkmate. The trust, Martin explained, as if reading my thoughts, is structured with two primary purposes. The first, obviously, is to provide for your care and comfort for the rest of your life. The house, the investments, the cash reserves, it's all there for you, untouchable by anyone else. But the trust has a secondary purpose, a fail-safe that is triggered by one very specific event. I read the clause aloud, my voice a hushed whisper of awe. Upon the sale or transfer of title of the primary residence located at 128 Maplewood Drive. That's the one, Martin said. If the house, the heart of the trust, the symbol of your life together, is ever sold or transferred out of the trust while you are still alive, it triggers the secondary purpose of the trust. It's an act that the trust interprets as you no longer needing or wanting the primary assets. And that secondary purpose is, I prompted, though I was already reading the stunning conclusion, the immediate and full liquidation of all other financial assets held within the trust. Martin confirmed, a note of grim satisfaction in his voice. The entire investment portfolio, the savings, every last liquid penny, and the proceeds from that liquidation are to be transferred in their entirety to a single beneficiary. I looked at the name of the beneficiary, and a genuine teary-eyed laugh escaped my lips. The Urban Youth Scholarship Fund. A local charity that Robert had championed for decades. A fund that provided college scholarships for underprivileged kids from our old neighborhood. It was his passion project, the legacy he was most proud of. It's brilliant, I breathed. They think they're getting the house and the inheritance, but the trust makes it so they can only have one, and if they take the house, they get a fully paid off house, and they forfeit an inheritance worth well over $2 million. Martin finished. They clearly found the will, but they never bothered to read the fine print of the trust that governs it. It's the perfect trap. Robert wanted to ensure that if Kevin ever tried to force you out of your home, he would be disinheriting himself in the process. A wave of love for my late husband, so fierce and so profound, washed over me. Even from beyond the grave, he was still protecting me. He had left me the perfect weapon. The plan began to form in my mind. Swift, simple, and utterly devastating. My children wanted me out of their way. They wanted a life without the burden of their aging mother. I would give them exactly what they wanted. Martin, I said, my voice no longer weak or tired. It was the voice of a woman in command. I know what I need to do, but I'll need your help to make it legally airtight. Eleanor, he replied, his voice ringing with a conviction that bolstered my own. It would be my absolute honor to help you scorch the earth. The plan was a study in simplicity. Its power lay not in complexity, but in its brutal, elegant logic. It would use Kevin and Tiffany's own greed and entitlement as the very instruments of their downfall. They had pushed me into a corner, expecting me to crumble. They had no idea I was about to use that corner as a fulcrum to move their entire world. My silence over the past day had been their opportunity. Now it would be my weapon. They believed I was oblivious, a frail creature lost in a post-surgical fog. I would not disabuse them of this notion. I would play the part of the grateful, slightly confused mother to perfection. My grief, which was still a raw and aching wound, would become the perfect camouflage for my resolve. After my call with Martin, the first step was to put the financial machinery in motion. I called my personal banker at our private local bank. He was an older gentleman named Mr. Davison, who had managed my and Robert's accounts for over 30 years. He had been at Robert's funeral. He was more than a banker, he was a friend. Eleanor, it's wonderful to hear your voice, he said, his tone warm and avuncular. We were so worried. How are you feeling? Getting stronger every day, John, I said, but I'm calling on a rather sensitive matter. I need to activate a security protocol that Robert and I established with you years ago. Do you recall? There was a brief pause. Of course, Eleanor. The Redwood Protocol. I remember it well. Robert was very specific. Is everything all right? The Redwood Protocol was a code word Robert had created. It signaled that I was making a decision under potential duress and that he was to follow my instructions to the letter, without question, and to speak of it to no one, especially not to my son. Everything is fine, John, I lied smoothly. I'm just beginning to put my affairs in order. It's time. I need you to prepare for a significant transfer of assets from the Vance Family Trust. It will be a full liquidation of the portfolio, and the recipient will be the Urban Youth Scholarship Fund. The transfer will be contingent upon a single event, the successful sale and closing of my primary residence. I will notify you when that occurs. Understood, Eleanor, he said, his voice a perfect blend of professional discretion and quiet concern. The protocol had done its job. He asked no more questions. We will be ready to execute the transfer upon your final authorization. The first gear had clicked into place. The second move was to orchestrate the public-facing part of the plan. I needed an actor, a trusted confederate who could play their role with convincing enthusiasm. I scrolled through my contacts and found the number for Sarah Jenkins, one of the top real estate agents in the city. Sarah wasn't just an agent, she was an old friend. We had served on the library board together for years. She was smart, impeccably dressed, and had a flair for the dramatic. I called her. Sarah, it's Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, darling, she exclaimed. I was just about to send you a casserole. How are you feeling? You gave us all such a scare. I'm on the mend. Sarah, thank you, I said, but I'm calling for a professional reason. The scare. Well, it's made me reevaluate things. This house is too much for me now. Robert is gone. Kevin is grown. It's time for me to downsize. I've decided to sell. The lie felt surprisingly natural on my tongue. It was the perfect, logical explanation for my sudden decision. A widow recovering from major surgery, wanting a simpler life. It was a narrative no one would question. Oh, Eleanor, she said, her voice softening with sympathy. I understand completely. Of course I would be honored to help you. When were you thinking of listing? Immediately, I said. In fact, I was hoping you could come over this morning, say 10 o'clock sharp. Bring the listing agreement. And Sarah, I added, the final critical instruction, could you please bring one of your for sale signs with you? I want to get the ball rolling as soon as possible. Consider it done, she said, her voice already buzzing with professional energy. We'll have this place sold in a week. The market is screaming for a property like yours. The second gear clicked into place. I hung up the phone and looked around the quiet study. The trap was set. The actors were in place. All that was left was to wait for my audience to arrive. I walked out of the study and went to the guest bathroom. I took a slow, careful shower, the warm water soothing the dull ache in my chest. I dressed myself not in the comfortable, worn-out robe I had been living in, but in a pair of tailored slacks and a crisp, cream-colored blouse. I put on a touch of lipstick. I looked in the mirror and saw not a patient, not a victim, but a woman in control. A woman who was about to teach her children a final, unforgettable lesson in consequences. A history lesson they would never forget. I came downstairs to find Kevin and Tiffany already in the kitchen, moving with the proprietary ease of established homeowners. Tiffany was at the gleaming new refrigerator, pulling out ingredients for a smoothie while Kevin was reading something on his phone at the island. A scowl etched on his face. The air was thick with their smug, entitled presence. They were expecting to find their mother weak, disoriented and pliable. They were expecting to begin their campaign of pressure and persuasion, to gently but firmly guide the confused old woman toward the stack of legal documents that would sign her life away. Instead, they found me showered, dressed and sitting at my small breakfast table by the bay window. I had a cup of tea in my hands, and the morning newspaper spread out before me. Next to me on the table was a small paper bag from the corner market, containing a single banana and a container of yogurt, my own damn food. They both stopped what they were doing and stared at me. I could see the surprise and a flicker of annoyance in their eyes. This was not the scene they had anticipated. I was not playing my assigned role. Morning, I said, my voice calm and pleasant as I turned a page of the paper. I didn't look at them. Mom, Kevin said, his voice tight. You're up early, you should be resting. It was a statement of concern, but it was laced with the steel of a command. I feel much better this morning, I replied cheerfully. A good night's sleep in my own, in a bed in my own house makes all the difference. Tiffany shot Kevin a look, a silent, impatient communication. She plastered her bright, artificial smile back on her face. Well, that's wonderful, Eleanor. But don't overdo it. We've got everything under control here. Oh, I know you do, dear, I said, finally looking up at her, my own smile just as placid and unreadable as hers. You've both been a tremendous help. They stood there uncertain, their script momentarily forgotten. They were predators whose prey had suddenly refused to act frightened. They didn't know how to proceed. Before they could regroup, before they could launch into whatever rehearsed speech they had prepared about my health and my future and the importance of planning, the doorbell rang. The sharp, clear chime cut through the tense silence in the kitchen. I'll get it, I said, folding my newspaper neatly. I stood up, moving with a deliberate, steady grace that belied the fact that my chest was a roadmap of stitches and staples. I walked to the front door, leaving them staring after me, their faces a mixture of confusion and suspicion. I could feel their eyes on my back. I opened the door to find Sarah Jenkins on the porch, a vision of professional competence in a sharp red blazer. She held a leather portfolio in one hand, and leaning against the porch railing next to her was a large, glossy for sale sign, the name of her prestigious realty firm emblazoned across the top in bold, confident letters. Sarah's eyes met mine, and I saw a flicker of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the drama we were about to co-author. She was a consummate professional. She knew a story when she saw one, and she was ready to play her part. She enveloped me in a warm, air-kissing hug, her voice loud and cheerful enough to carry easily into the kitchen where my son and his wife were listening. Eleanor, darling, you look wonderful, simply wonderful. Are you ready to do this? I've got all the paperwork just as you asked, and I have to say the buzz on a property like this is going to be incredible. We're going to have offers by the weekend. As she spoke, she stepped past me into the foyer, her gaze sweeping the space with a critical, appraising eye. We'll need to stage the living room. Of course. A few minor tweaks to depersonalize it. Buyers need to be able to envision their own lives here. She turned and gave me a conspiratorial wink that only I could see. Then she walked back outside, picked up the heavy sign, and with a series of practiced, efficient movements, planted it firmly in the center of my front lawn. The sharp metal legs sank deep into the soft, manicured grass. It stood there, a bold, undeniable declaration of intent, perfectly visible from the bay window in the kitchen. The trap was sprung. The sight of the for sale sign, stark and official on the familiar green expanse of the front lawn, was like a silent explosion. Kevin and Tiffany came rushing out of the kitchen, their faces masks of disbelief and dawning horror. They stopped dead in the foyer, staring first at the sign through the open front door, and then at me and Sarah, who was now bustling back inside, all professional energy. What is this? Kevin demanded, his voice a choked, strangled sound. What the hell is going on? Sarah, ever the actress, looked at him with an expression of polite confusion. Oh, hello, you must be Kevin. Your mother was just telling me about you. I'm Sarah Jenkins. I'm just so thrilled to be handling the sale of this magnificent property. The sale? Tiffany shrieked, her voice rising an octave. The carefully constructed facade of the supportive daughter-in-law had shattered, revealing the raw, grasping greed beneath. You can't sell this house. This is our house. I almost laughed at the slip. Our house. The truth, finally, in all its ugly clarity. I turned to them, my expression one of calm, serene reason, the history teacher preparing to deliver her final lecture. Tiffany dear, I said gently, this is not your house, it's my house, and I've decided I no longer wish to live here. But, where will you go? Kevin stammered, looking completely lost. He looked like a little boy who had just been told his favorite amusement park was closing forever. Oh, I'll find a nice smaller place, I said breezily. A condo downtown perhaps. Something more manageable for a woman in my condition. You were right, Kevin, I added, looking him directly in the eye, my voice imbued with a sweet, cutting sincerity. You said I should have my own food, and it made me realize, you're absolutely right. I should have my own things, my own space, a life that is entirely my own. You and Tiffany have your own lives to lead. You shouldn't be burdened with taking care of me. Burdened? He sputtered. We're not. We want to take care of you. Of course you do, sweetheart, I said, patting his arm. But I've made up my mind. It's time for me to move on. Selling the house is the first step. The panic was rolling off them in waves. This was not in their script. This was a catastrophic plot twist they had never anticipated. They had a plan for a weak, dependent mother, not for a decisive woman making proactive life choices. You can't do this, Tiffany insisted, her face flushed with blotchy red patches of rage. "We live here. We have plans." "I'm sure you do," I said, "but those plans will have to change. Sarah seems to think the house will sell very quickly." I smiled warmly at my friend who was watching the scene with the fascinated, detached air of a theater critic. Then I delivered the final, devastating blow. I walked over to the small table in the foyer where the mail was kept. I picked up a thick blue portfolio, a copy of the Vance Family Trust master file that Martin Hayes had couriered over that morning. "You know," I said thoughtfully, as if the idea had just occurred to me, "selling the house will finally allow me to fulfill your father's greatest wish." I slid the heavy document across the polished surface of the table toward them. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "I'm not sure if you two ever took the time to read this, but your father was a very clever man, a great planner." I tapped a finger on the cover. "It's all in here. He always wanted to make a significant final contribution to his scholarship fund." I opened the portfolio to the page I had bookmarked, the page with Article 4, Section B. I had taken a highlighter and drawn a neat thick yellow line under the scorched earth clause. "It's really quite beautiful," I continued, my voice filled with a faux nostalgic warmth. "The trust is structured so that the very moment that I sign the deed of this house over to a new owner, it triggers a secondary provision, the complete and total liquidation of all the financial assets, the stocks, the bonds, everything, and all of it, every last penny, goes directly to the Urban Youth Scholarship Fund. Isn't that wonderful? We'll finally be able to make that multi-million-dollar donation your father always dreamed of. Just think of all the children we'll be able to send to college." I watched their faces as they read the highlighted clause. I saw the slow dawning horror in their eyes as the words sank in, as the full catastrophic implications of my actions became clear to them. I saw the exact moment that they understood. They had been played. They had overreached and in doing so, had lost everything. By trying to steal the house, by creating the very conditions that had forced my hand, they had single-handedly triggered the clause that would vaporize the massive inheritance they had been banking on, the inheritance they had been willing to destroy my life to obtain. Kevin's face crumpled first. His jaw went slack, and his eyes filled with the wide, terrified tears of a man who had just gambled away his entire future. Tiffany stared at the document, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. The smugness, the entitlement, the cold calculating ambition, it all dissolved, leaving behind nothing but the raw, ugly face of pure, unadulterated greed. And then, the tears began. They were not tears of sadness or remorse. They were the hot, ugly, desperate tears of defeated thieves weeping for the treasure that had just vanished before their very eyes. The silence that followed their outburst was a thick, heavy thing, broken only by the sound of their ragged, hitching sobs. They stood in the foyer of my house, the house they had tried to steal, and they cried like children who had been told that Christmas was cancelled forever. It was a pathetic, ugly, and deeply satisfying sight. Sarah, the consummate professional, chose that moment to clear her throat. "Well," she said brightly, her voice cutting through the gloom, "if you'll excuse me, Eleanor, I'm just going to start taking some preliminary measurements of the living room." She gave me a look of profound, theatrical sympathy and swept past the weeping couple as if they were nothing more than inconveniently placed statues. I left them there, wallowing in the wreckage of their own greed. I walked back to the kitchen, made myself another cup of tea, and sat down at my table by the window. I watched as Sarah's assistant arrived and helped her hammer the for sale sign more firmly into the lawn. It looked beautiful, it looked like freedom. The next day was a blur of quiet, efficient activity. Kevin and Tiffany moved about the house in a daze of defeated silence. The fight had gone out of them completely, replaced by a sullen, resentful resignation. They packed their belongings into boxes, the sharp, angry sounds of their movements echoing the ugly state of their emotions. They barely spoke to each other. Their alliance, forged in greed, had dissolved in failure. There was no one to blame but themselves, and the bitterness of that knowledge was a poison they were now forced to swallow. They didn't speak to me at all. They avoided my gaze, flinching whenever I entered a room. I had become a ghost to them again, but this time, I was not a ghost of a frail, fading mother. I was the ghost of their forfeited fortune, a walking, breathing reminder of their monumental stupidity. I spent the day on the phone. The first call was to Martin Hayes, to inform him that the plan had been executed perfectly. He was delighted, and we made an appointment for the following week to begin the official process of restructuring the trust for my new, simpler life. The second call was to Mr. Davison, the banker. "John," I said, "it's Eleanor. We won't be needing to activate the Redwood Protocol after all. The situation has resolved itself. I could almost hear the smile in his voice as he said he was relieved to hear it. The rest of my calls were to real estate agents and contractors. Sarah had been right. The moment my house was unofficially on the market, her phone had started ringing off the hook. By noon I had 3 informal all-cash offers, all well above the asking price. I happily listened to her describe the bidding war that was already brewing. I was not just selling a house, I was liquidating my old life, and the returns were proving to be excellent. Late that afternoon, a moving truck pulled into the driveway. Kevin and Tiffany loaded their boxes, their new stainless steel refrigerator and their mountain of labeled containers into it. The last time I saw my son, he was standing by the truck looking back at the house, his face a miserable crumpled mask of regret. It was the face of a man who had tried to steal a kingdom and had ended up losing even his small place in the court. He finally understood the price of his betrayal, and it was a price he would be paying for the rest of his life. They drove away without a word of goodbye. The moving truck rumbled down the street, turned the corner and was gone. A profound, deep, and beautiful silence settled over the house. It was not the empty, lonely silence of loss. It was the clean, quiet and peaceful silence of sovereignty. I walked through the rooms of my home once again. I ran my hand over the mantelpiece, repositioning Robert's photos to their rightful central place. I went into the kitchen and made myself a simple dinner, using my own pots, my own pans from my own unlabeled drawers. I ate in the sunroom, looking out at my garden as the evening sky turned a soft dusky rose. The house was mine. My future was mine. My life was mine. The pain of my son's betrayal would likely never fade completely, but it no longer had the power to define me. It was simply a part of my history now, a lesson learned, a battle won, and for the first time since coming home from the hospital, I felt the deep, unshakable peace of a woman who was finally and completely the sole author of her own story.